Hey folks, I hope you're having a great week and hanging in there in Zoom University, surviving the fall quarter all online. Really happy to be participating in and contributing to this pandemic book club. And today I have a new recommendation for you. I've been reading this excellent book called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety by Sarah Jaquette Ray. As you can see, I've been taking a lot of notes as well. This is a phenomenal little book that addresses something that climate advocacy activism doesn't often, which is to say your emotional and existential health during climate crisis. The existential crisis of climate trauma is a very real problem and can make a lot of people seem like they're powerless, right? And so this book really is dedicated to and aimed toward Gen Z or late millennials, the so-called climate generation, a book that is just helping us understand not just the effects of climate change. I mean, we all pretty much understand what's going on. We're educating ourselves, and the more we learn, the more powerless you can feel, right? So assuming we understand the effects of climate change, assuming that we're passionate about climate justice, about mitigating the negative effects of humanity on the climate, this book helps us not to go numb with horror. It helps us stop from succumbing to despair in the face of such a huge problem, what Timothy Morton has actually called a hyper object. It can be easy to believe that you're too small to make a difference. But this sort of defeatist attitude is precisely what is preventing real change from happening. And so this book, aptly named Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, is just aiming to provide a few tools, emotional tools, mindfulness tools, to help you resist burnout and resist despair. So as I mentioned before, this book is good for everyone, but is specifically dedicated to Gen Z or the climate generation. Your generation has always known climate change, has grown up with the effects, has in a very real way realized since you're old enough to walk that you're inheriting the issues and the problems and the mistakes of hundreds of years of generations before you. Now that can be very difficult in its own right, but once you realize the enormity of the problem, it can be absolutely numbing, right? It can be something that theorists have called infowhelm, when you get so much information that you just feel like all you can do is stand still and stare in horror. So as much as Gen Z, like all generations, is a very diverse generation, it has many people from many different backgrounds, there are certain characteristics that your generation tends to share, and this is who the book is written for. First, you care greatly about climate change and social justice, and you see a link between the two. You feel financially insecure. If you're in college, you'll probably owe an average of $40,000 by the time you graduate. You are a generation of debt. If you have graduated, you're worried about finding a job. And if you're first gen, it's quite likely that you'll be less well off than your parents. Your generation is troubled by the increasing disparity between the rich and the poor. You were raised with smartphones, social media, and unprecedented internet access to global networks and information. Although you're more connected and more educated than previous generations, you're also statistically more likely to be lonely, depressed, even suicidal than previous generations. By the time you reach college, and you're already here, 66 to 85% of Gen Z has experienced some form of trauma. Gen Z is also the most ethnically diverse generation in US history, and you're also the most stressed, but the least likely to vote. So, taking all of this into account, all of these sort of markers for Gen Z, which is also called the climate generation, Sarah Jaquette Ray, who is a professor, really tries to tailor this book toward the specific set of challenges and difficulties that your generation faces. And I'm a bit older than you, but I can tell you that I actually found this book extremely useful as well. The biggest thing to remember, she says, is millennials and Gen Z have been beaten down over and over again by being called lazy, entitled, selfish, arrogant, stupid, caring only about their technology. And this could not be further from the truth. Your generation cares deeply about the world, and sometimes it's difficult to find the tools to actually make a meaningful difference. This book is a great way to begin to set up the emotional and affective tool set to sort of help you along your journey to helping mitigate climate change. So One thing that she talks about with regard to empowerment is the fact that we really need to cultivate a radical imagination. Speculative futures have power. The stories we tell have power. She says what we need to do is hack the story, not to pretend everything's okay. She's actually very critical of hope in this book. She's also quite critical of the idea of being willfully ignorant, as well she should be. However, hacking the story, choosing what story you want to fight for, what sort of future you think is worth working toward, this is a very powerful thing. She says she did an exercise with her students once saying, imagine that all the things that you want to see happen with regard to climate change and climate advocacy have come to pass. What sort of future would that look like? What would you envision? And she found that most of her students could much more easily imagine the end of the world than a better, more positive, juster future where some climate advocacy has actually worked. And this was shocking and horrifying to her. And this is actually why she decided to write the book. Your existential health, she writes, is the soil in which the future you desire will germinate. Now, it can feel selfish to look at self-care, to look at resisting existential burnout, but she argues it's actually not selfish at all. It's absolutely imperative. Guilt will only get you so far. Working yourself to death causes burnout, right? She says that some form of guilt, nihilism, despair is part of the journey that you have to take, but eventually you have to get beyond that, right? In order to be an efficacious activist, you have to learn how to resist burnout, to resist despair, to resist infowhelm, figure out what your calling is, what you're good at, scale your action to realistic proportions. You as an individual are not likely to make a huge sweeping global change, and that's okay, because what is the ocean but a multitude of drops? Right? Every single one of us, tiny as we are, works together towards something, right? Now that sounds a little corny. I know. But imagine if every single one of us said, oh, I can't do anything. It's too big. I guess I should just sit here and do nothing, right? Well, then what's happening? Exactly nothing, right? This sort of point of view led her to think differently about her role as a teacher, to think differently about what sorts of responsibilities she had to her students, not just to her planet, but also to her role as an educator. Perhaps some of you want to be teachers in the future. Perhaps some of you want to be activists. Perhaps some of you are looking to go into business or any other myriad law, any other myriad set of professions. But depending on what you're good at, depending on what your passion is, each of these things has things that we can be doing to help mitigate climate change, to help make a better world, to cultivate the radical imagination necessary to imagine a juster future, right? And so with that regard, she actually writes quite a bit about wisdom, about mindfulness. She actually does so from, yes, a mindful and Zen point of view, but also from the view of cognitive science. She argues, as many other scholars have, that cognitive science and mindfulness are actually not at odds with each other. These things that feel new agey and not rational, quote unquote, scare quotes, are actually, they dovetail quite a bit. They're looking at the same sorts of problems, just from different points of view. She says, beware of this sort of rugged individual ideology, this instrumental ideology, this idea that any meaningful change has to come with a grand sweeping proportions, right? She actually quotes author and activist Howard Zinn here. Revolutionary change does not come as one cataclysmic moment. Beware of such moments, but as an endless succession of surprises, moving zigzag toward a more decent society. We don't have to engage in grand heroic actions to participate in the process of change. In such a way, change doesn't come as one silver bullet solution. It's a process, it's a praxis, it's little things that you do every single day. We've all heard the adage, Rome wasn't built in a day. A dissertation wasn't written in an hour, right? But applying this to something as large and as frightening as climate change can be very difficult. And your generation has the unfair burden of being the first generation that really, from birth, has been asked to do that. So she talks, among other things, about self-compassion and slow hope. She says hope in and of itself can actually be bad, which sounds very counterintuitive, but hope can sort of cause you to blindly wish for something better or to set your sights too low, right? She says what we need is slow hope. We need to not fear the future. We need to desire the future. So what actions can we be taking to create a future that we actually desire? The perception that social change happens only on an individual scale actually creates defeatism. It causes people to pause before they've even begun. So she talks about being in relation, not just with other activists, but with other people in your community. We often, because of social media battles and the news and just the sorts of polarized conversations we've been having increasingly since 2016, but before that even, we often think that everything has to be a zero-sum game. Everything is a battle, everything's an argument, everything's a winner or loser. And she says, well, that sort of thing actually creates polarization and holds back change as well. She actually quite wisely says, if we feel that we're always constantly battling some evil other, our anger and our fear will deplete us, and it will keep us from actually bridging these conversations, finding common ground. Now, trust me, there are certain people who hold certain opinions that I have really no desire to find common ground with. I'm sorry, I will not debate with you whether or not certain people deserve human dignity and human rights, right? But we don't always have to take it to these extremes. We can say, okay, so and so thinks that climate change is overrated. Okay, fine. But so and so also cares very deeply about preserving the natural forest in their area, about outdoorsmen, sports, about cultivating the biodiversity, right? We shouldn't just write that person off and say, oh, well, they're delusional, right? You may disagree, but you can work together. For example, family members, community members work together toward a goal that actually does do some good in the world. You don't have to be in perfect agreement in order to work together toward a shared future. Now, she also talks a bit about how climate advocacy and climate justice are deeply imbricated within the systems of capitalism, systems of racism, systems of extractive colonial thought. We're all entangled in systems of injustice, and we do need to acknowledge that. We need to be mindful of that and understand how deeply unfair, cruel systems have been something that historically we've benefited from. However, again, guilt itself doesn't lead to efficacy. Neither does blind hope, right? We need praxis, we need slow hope, we need critical mindfulness. All of this to resist burnout, but also to start to build a future that we can actually look forward to, as opposed to feel despair in contemplating. I'll leave you with a quote here that was deeply meaningful for me. And I think perhaps is something that you, as busy college students juggling 3, 4, 5 classes, juggling jobs, juggling family obligations, might also find meaningful. Remember that cognition, attention, empathy, compassion, these are all finite resources. Now, I'm not saying that you should jealously guard them for anyone except yourself. We're like, no, of course not. But you have to remember that you are not a limitless well of energy. She says, our imagine is a resource we should fiercely protect. Excuse me. Our imagination is a resource we should fiercely protect. Our attention, too, is precious. We frivolously give it away and let others take it at great cost to ourselves, those around us, and the earth. Our attention is fertilizer, sunlight, and water, encouraging whatever it focuses on to thrive. Let your attention be like sunlight and rain, cultivating that which you wish to grow. Now, I highly recommend that you pick up a copy of this book. Again, it was just published, 2020, brand new, hot off the press, and the only book that I've ever seen that addresses the emotional and affective components of climate change and gives you an emotional toolkit to keep working and moving forward, even when the future is deeply uncertain. We're actually doing a book club in the Lytton Environment Research Center centering around this book. We'll be reading it throughout the year. We'll be focusing on 3 chapters per meeting, 1 meeting per quarter, and I'd love to see you there. I'll be sending around a PDF copy, and I really hope that folks think about dropping in. Even people who wouldn't normally think of themselves as environmentalists or environmentally focused, check it out. We're open to everyone. Thank you.